It took my son Nathan less than 2 years to go from saying he needed a few months of temporary housing to standing at my dinner table telling 12 guests that I was getting confused and might need support. He said the word support the way people say it when they mean something entirely different. I was 73 years old. I had cooked the dinner he was speaking over. I was sitting at the head of my own table in my own house, wearing a jacket whose inside pocket contained a legal document signed 3 days earlier by my lawyer. I had been waiting for the right moment to use it. Nathan had just given me that moment in front of exactly the audience I would have chosen. But to understand why I had that document in my jacket pocket at a family dinner, you need to understand what had been happening in my home across the previous 20 months. You need to understand who my son Nathan was before his wife's influence changed how he spoke to me and how he thought about the house I owned. You need to understand who I was before I became the kind of father who brings legal paperwork to his own table because events have made it necessary. This story did not begin at that dinner. It began quietly in small moves across many months before it arrived at the moment Nathan chose a public setting to suggest I was losing my competence. That moment was the one I had been preparing for. Before I continue, I want to ask something of you. Please subscribe to this channel if you have not done so already, and leave a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from. If you have ever had someone use a public moment to question your mental clarity in front of people whose opinion mattered to you, and you have felt the particular injustice of having no immediate answer equal to the insult, this story is yours. This community exists for people who understand that the right response to that kind of challenge is not always the immediate one, and that preparation is its own form of dignity. Thank you for being here. Now, let me tell you exactly what happened when Nathan finished his sentence and I reached into my jacket pocket. My name is Franklin. I am 73 years old. I spent my career in financial management, working as a controller and eventually as chief financial officer for a mid-sized manufacturing company before I retired at 68. I am a person who understands numbers, contracts, and the legal weight of properly executed documents. My wife Grace died 6 years ago after a long marriage that I am grateful for in a way that is difficult to express without becoming sentimental about it, and I am not a sentimental man. We had 2 children, my daughter Patricia, who lives across the country and who has maintained an honest and consistent relationship with me, and my son Nathan, who lives nearby and who, after Grace died, positioned himself as the primary presence in my life. Nathan's wife is Deborah. It is not possible to tell this story accurately without explaining who Deborah is, because she designed almost everything that followed. And she designed it with a patience and attention to incremental detail that I found professionally impressive, even as I found it personally difficult. Nathan and Deborah had been renting a house in our neighborhood for 3 years when Grace died. 3 months after the funeral, Nathan came to me and said their rental lease was not being renewed. He said they needed temporary housing while they found their next place. He said temporary specifically. He said a few months specifically. I had 4 bedrooms and I was alone. I told them they could use the guest suite. That single decision was the beginning of everything that followed. The house was not a simple property to me. Grace and I had bought it 29 years earlier, the year Patricia was born. We had renovated it in stages across our marriage, each choice made together, each room reflecting a decision we had reached through conversation rather than imposition. The kitchen had been redone the year Nathan finished university. The garden had been reshaped during the years of Grace's health decline so she could tend smaller plots from a seated position. Every room held a specific memory attached to a specific time in the life we had built together. The deed was in my name alone, which Grace had insisted on when we bought the house. She had wanted a single, clear point of ownership in case of future complexity. I had agreed. Her instinct, it turned out, had been exactly right. Grace's workroom was in the basement. She had kept fabrics there, a sewing machine, and projects in various stages of completion, some going back to the early years of our marriage. After she died, I had not touched that room. I was not ready to touch it, and I did not feel I owed anyone an explanation for that readiness timetable. The room was there, complete exactly as she had left it, and the fact that it was there and untouched was a form of continuity I needed. When Deborah suggested over breakfast one morning that the basement might be a logical candidate for a rental apartment, since it was unused space, I told her what the space contained. She received this information with the patient expression of someone who has decided to wait out an obstacle rather than address it. The house represented 29 years of careful financial management, as well as 29 years of personal history. Grace and I had made conservative choices throughout our lives, specifically so that the house and everything in it would be fully and unambiguously ours by the time we reached the years we're supposed to enjoy without the complications of debt or dependence. I had achieved that position exactly as planned. I owned the house outright. I managed it without difficulty. The management was not a burden I needed to be relieved of, and the house was not an asset I needed to be encouraged to reconsider. It was mine in the most complete legal and personal sense of that word, and it would remain mine for precisely as long as I chose. After Nathan and Deborah moved in, the changes began in the way I had heard described by others but never experienced directly. Small things first. The kitchen arrangement changed. A different coffee brand appeared. Then the old brand disappeared. Deborah began using my study desk while I was out and leaving her materials on it when she left. A new couch appeared in the living room. The rug Grace had chosen was replaced with one Deborah had purchased without discussion. I noted each change without commenting on it, because responding to each one individually would have created constant small conflicts without addressing the underlying direction of what was happening. What was happening was that a different set of assumptions about who occupied the house was being installed incrementally. Nathan asked me one evening whether I had thought about downsizing. He framed it as a practical consideration given the house's size relative to my current needs as a single occupant. I told him the house was not difficult for me to maintain because I was maintaining it, as I always had, without any assistance. He nodded and did not pursue it that evening. But the question itself was significant. It was the first time my son had suggested that the house I owned might be better suited to different arrangements. A few months later, Deborah began referring to the house in conversations with neighbors and visitors in the future tense, as though its current form was provisional and she was the person who would determine what came next. I began keeping notes. The conversation about my driving changed something permanently. Nathan raised it on a Sunday morning in front of Deborah and their daughter, saying he had noticed I was taking longer on familiar routes and that a driving assessment might be sensible. I had not had any incidents. My license was fully current. My last renewal had passed without any concern from the examiner. I asked Nathan when he had observed me taking longer on familiar routes, given that I drove alone and he was rarely in the car with me. He said Deborah had mentioned it. Deborah had not driven with me either. I told them both that I was fully capable of assessing my own driving and had not asked for their opinion on the subject. The table went quiet in the way it goes quiet when something has been said that clarifies a situation rather than improving it. Deborah began asking questions about my health insurance and estate planning during the third month. She framed these as expressions of practical concern, the kind that responsible family members raised with aging parents. She mentioned that a colleague of Nathan's had experienced difficulties with his father's affairs after a sudden health event. She suggested that having everything organized in advance would reduce complications. I responded with the minimum information the questions required and recorded each conversation in the notes I had been keeping. The questions about the estate were different from the questions about the driving. They were directed at a specific piece of information, the state of my assets, who had access to them, and what would happen to them in various circumstances. I had answered nothing that gave her what she was looking for. The bank letter changed my understanding of the situation completely. Patricia was visiting in the spring, her first long visit since Nathan and Deborah had moved in. On her third evening, she came to my study after dinner and showed me a letter she had found while helping me sort accumulated correspondence. The letter was from my bank, related to an inquiry about the process for adding a joint account holder. It had been opened, read, and resealed before reaching me. The resealing was careful, but not careful enough. Only Nathan and Deborah had access to the house during the days before Patricia arrived. I looked at the letter for a long moment. I thanked Patricia, asked her not to mention it further until I had thought about it, and after she went to bed, I sat at my desk for 2 hours, considering what I had been watching. The full picture assembled itself that night, with the clarity that comes when a final piece of information gives shape to everything that preceded it. The gradual assumption of household space, the references to the house's future, the suggestions about downsizing, the questions about driving and competence, the estate planning inquiries, and now the bank letter, opened and resealed, representing an attempt to understand what was required to add a name to an account I held alone. Each element had been individually explainable. Together, they described something that had a name and a pattern I recognized. I was not facing a family that had moved in and become comfortable. I was facing a family that had moved in with a strategy, and the bank letter was the piece that made the strategy undeniable. I called Thomas the following morning Thomas had handled my professional and personal legal affairs for 20 years. He had managed Grace's estate, reviewed my retirement arrangements, and handled several property transactions over the decades we had worked together. I described everything in sequence: the gradual changes, the driving comments, the estate questions, the bank letter, and the overall pattern of behavior I had been observing and noting for months. Thomas listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. He said he could see me on Friday and that we should discuss several things. His tone told me he had heard this kind of description before and that he understood what it required without needing me to characterize it further. Thomas recommended 3 things at our Friday meeting. The first was a formal cognitive assessment to establish a contemporaneous professional record of my mental competence. The second was a written clarification of the occupancy arrangement at the house, confirming that Nathan and Deborah were guests and not tenants, and that no rental agreement or possessory interest of any kind existed. The third was preparation of a formal notice to vacate under the applicable residential statute, providing 60 days for the occupants to make alternative arrangements. Thomas drafted the notice. He was thorough and precise, as he had always been. The language was unambiguous. The legal basis was sound. I reviewed every word. I signed the document on a Thursday morning. I folded it and placed it in the inside pocket of my jacket. The cognitive assessment was conducted by Dr. Anand, a neurologist with whom Thomas had worked on previous matters requiring formal competency documentation. The assessment took 2.5 hours and covered every standard domain: memory, reasoning, language, executive function, and spatial orientation. Dr. Anand provided me with his written report at a follow-up appointment. The report was clear and unambiguous. I was cognitively intact, fully competent in every measurable domain, and operating well within normal ranges for my age. I had Thomas file the report with the eviction notice documentation. The 2 documents together created a complete picture: a competent adult with clear legal ownership of a property, issuing a valid notice to people occupying it without a formal tenancy agreement. I kept the eviction notice in my jacket pocket for 3 days. I went about my ordinary life during those 3 days. I had breakfast with Nathan and Deborah on the Friday morning. I discussed the garden with Nathan that afternoon. I attended a neighbors' meeting on the Saturday. I was waiting not because I was uncertain about what I was going to do, but because the correct moment had not yet arrived. The correct moment required a specific combination of circumstances: enough witnesses, enough context, and a triggering event that would make my response feel proportional rather than arbitrary. The dinner Nathan had organized for the following Sunday had 12 guests invited. I noted this when Nathan mentioned it. When he described who would be attending, I recognized the correct moment. The Sunday dinner Nathan had organized was the kind of family gathering that had occurred regularly in that house across many years. My sister and her husband were coming, 2 longtime friends of mine who had known me since before Grace, Nathan's colleague and his wife, several others. Nathan had planned and organized the dinner himself, which I took at face value as a gesture of family care. I cooked for the occasion because cooking in my own kitchen for people I cared about was something I had always done. I set the table, prepared the meal, and dressed for the evening. Before I left my bedroom, I patted the inside pocket of my jacket to confirm the document was still there. It was. I went downstairs and welcomed the first guests. The dinner proceeded well through the first courses. The conversation was the conversation of a gathering of people who knew each other across long histories, comfortable, slightly overlapping, full of the specific references that accumulate between people who have shared years. My sister was animated on the subject of her garden. My old friends talked about a trip they were planning. Nathan's colleague was interesting about developments in his field. I participated in all of it with the full attention it deserved. I was not distracted. I was not absent. I was present in the way I had always been present at gatherings in my own home, because the house and the people in it were mine to be present for, and that was not a capacity I had lost. During the dessert course, Nathan cleared his throat in the particular way of someone preparing to say something that has been rehearsed. He said he wanted to raise something he had been thinking about as a family. He said he had been worried about me lately. He said I had been getting confused more often than before, and that it might be time to consider what kind of additional support I actually needed. He said this in the particular tone people use when they want to appear responsible rather than self-interested. The table went still with a specific stillness that falls when something has been said that everyone present recognizes as significant. My sister looked at me with careful attention. My old friends were completely motionless. I looked at Nathan and then around the table. I reached into my jacket pocket. I removed the eviction notice and placed it on the table in front of Nathan. I told the room in a voice that carried without requiring volume that I had spent the previous several weeks reviewing my legal position with respect to the informal occupancy arrangement in my home, and that the document before Nathan was a formal notice to vacate, prepared and witnessed by my lawyer, giving his family 60 days to identify and arrange alternative housing. I did not explain further. I did not apologize for the timing. I had not chosen the timing. Nathan had chosen it by selecting that particular moment at that particular table to present me as someone whose capacity for independent judgment was in question. The document was my answer to that characterization. It was a more complete answer than any sentence I could have offered. The room was quiet for a long moment. Nathan looked at the document. He looked at me. He did not speak. Deborah, across the table, had an expression that was not one I had seen on her before, the expression of someone running calculations rapidly and not arriving at satisfactory results. My sister looked at me with something that was not surprise exactly, but something close to recognition. One of my oldest friends reached for his wine glass and said nothing, which was the correct thing to do. I picked up my fork and returned to my dessert, which was a tart I had made that afternoon from a recipe Grace kept in a notebook she had inherited from her mother. The evening continued. Guests departed. Nathan and Deborah went upstairs without speaking to me. Nathan had chosen that public moment because he believed it would work. He had calculated that delivering the competency concern in front of my sister, my friends, and his own colleagues would create a form of social pressure that I would not be able to counter without seeming defensive or unstable. The calculation assumed that I had no prepared response and that surprise was his ally. The calculation was wrong on both counts. I had been preparing a response for 3 weeks, and the surprise was his, not mine. What my son had not understood across the months of their incremental occupation of my home was that the specific professional background he was dealing with included 20 years of experience preparing exactly the kind of documentation he had just been handed. He had chosen the moment poorly. Deborah's design had been careful and patient. She'd moved incrementally, changed things gradually, and allowed time to create the impression that the changes were a natural consequence of the living arrangement rather than a deliberate campaign. The strategy was intelligent. It was also the kind of strategy that works on people who are not paying attention. And I had been paying attention since the second month. The bank letter was the error that confirmed what careful attention had already revealed. Deborah had been thorough in most respects, but she had underestimated what a person with 20 years of financial management experience would notice about a letter that had been opened and resealed by someone other than the addressee. That underestimation was the one that mattered. Nathan and Deborah vacated the house within the 60-day window. The departure was not graceful. There were several conversations I would have preferred not to have, covering ground that neither of us found comfortable. Nathan accused me of having chosen a public moment to humiliate him. I told him that he had chosen a public moment to describe me as confused in front of 12 people, and that I had chosen the same moment to clarify my actual legal position. He said the situations were not equivalent. I told him I disagreed with that assessment, and that the cognitive evaluation Thomas had filed alongside the notice was available to anyone who wished to review my actual mental state. He did not pursue the subject further. The 60 days passed. The house became mine again. Following Nathan and Deborah's departure within the 60-day window, I walked through every room of the house Grace and I had built, finally feeling the space return to its true meaning as a sanctuary of memory and independent living. Patricia later confirmed that she had intentionally sought out the bank letter to validate her suspicions, providing the final evidence I needed to move from silent observation to the decisive legal action I had so carefully prepared. Today, while my relationship with Nathan remains a slow and cautious rebuilding from the ruins of his parents' calculation, I reside in my home with the absolute peace provided by my documented competency and the strength of my own convictions. I chose a public instrument to answer a public challenge, proving that preparation is the highest form of dignity when your autonomy is at stake. So I ask you, if your clarity was used as a weapon against you in front of everyone who mattered, would you have opted for a private conversation, or would you have done exactly what I did to secure your future? Tell me in the comments below.